Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll be discussing two disappearance cases that are disturbingly close to resolution, yet frustratingly remain unsolved for deeply unsettling reasons. You'll understand what I mean as the story unfolds. While the incidents described might seem brief or vague, they are extremely disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly recommended. Intro music. It was a slow, uneventful October afternoon at the Chelmsford Car Wash in Massachusetts. One of those dull days where time seems to drag on endlessly. Located on a main road between gas stations and strip malls, the car wash was a place most people passed by without ever really noticing. But on that particular day in October of 1998, everything changed. One young worker, bored and looking for something to do, decided to take a short break and amuse himself by tossing a ball against the car wash wall, letting it bounce back so he could throw it again. On one throw, he used a bit too much force, and the ball bounced off wildly, sailing over his head into the empty lot beside the building. That empty space was nothing more than an area overgrown with weeds and loose dirt. He walked toward the spot where the ball had landed, and that S when he saw something strange. Partially buried in the ground was something oddly clean and white, too clean to be a rock or tree root. Curious, he knelt down to look more closely, and it didn't take long to realize that it was a jawbone, unmistakably human. Police soon flooded the area, thoroughly investigating the lot next to the car wash. Over the following 3 days, more bones were discovered. Although there was no flesh remaining, a delicate silver herringbone necklace was still around the neck, suggesting the remains likely belonged to a woman. As investigators dug into the case, they were surprised to find that no local missing person report matched the discovery. No family or friends came forward claiming the body, a fact that, while unsettling, made sense once it became clear the bones had likely been there for several years. Someone had taken time to dig a shallow grave, no more than 10 inches deep, not to hide the crime, but simply to discard it. For nearly 10 years, the girl whose remains were found had been missing, and no one had noticed or reported her gone. So, who was she? What happened to her? And why did no one search for her? Well, before her remains were uncovered in that forgotten lot, Nancy Ann Lackey Launt had already become a ghost in her own life, drifting from place to place with no real sense of home. Her early years were filled with pain and neglect. Born into a family where love was unknown and violence was a daily reality, Nancy's childhood was tragically scarred from the beginning. Nancy Ann's mother, Leona, was a volatile alcoholic, the type who internalized her anger until it exploded onto her children. By the time Nancy Ann was only 4 years old, the damage inflicted on her was already unimaginable. One night, someone twisted Nancy Ann's leg until it broke. Whether it was done with intent or by accident didn't matter. That incident was the tipping point when the state finally intervened. The Child Welfare Division removed 3 out of Leona's 4 children from her custody. Nancy and 2 of her siblings were placed under state care, leaving behind her brother Paul, who was overlooked and remained with their mother. By then, Nancy Ann had already learned a hard truth. Adults were not to be trusted. To her, they were little more than drunken monsters who spoke with their fists. As a result, she withdrew deep into herself, regressing to childlike behaviors. She sucked her thumb until it was raw, wet the bed far beyond a typical age, and jumped at the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Then, in 1979, a glimmer of hope appeared. At just 8.5 years old, Nancy Ann was adopted by the Launt family. Soon after, they relocated and eventually settled in Fort Washington, Maryland. For a while, things genuinely seemed better, almost safe. Nancy Ann became a quiet, artistic child. She immersed herself in music, loved to write and draw, and found ways to escape into her imagination. But the emotional wounds from her early life never fully healed. Deep down, she was still that frightened little girl who believed even the smallest mistake could trigger disaster. A spilled drink or a late arrival would leave her bracing for punishment. Still, Nancy never let go of thoughts about her biological family, particularly her scattered siblings. She often reached out, writing letters and making phone calls in hopes of reconnecting. 12 years passed. Nancy Ann grew into a young woman, standing on the threshold of adulthood, but still bound to a painful childhood. Eventually, her past pulled at her too strongly to resist. In 1989, something inside Nancy Ann gave way, or perhaps she simply couldn't ignore the yearning anymore. She began to rebel against the safe, structured life the Launts had built for her. What her adoptive parents didn't know was that her rebellion wasn't aimless. She was preparing to return home. Nancy Ann wasn't running from her life. She was running to something. She was moving toward the mother who had broken her, the family that had abandoned her, and the unresolved questions that haunted her for years. At 17, when most teenagers are thinking about prom, graduation, or college, Nancy Ann was focused on something entirely different. That summer of 1989, she made her decision. Without informing the Launts, she dropped out of school, packed her things, and left behind the only semblance of stability she'd ever known. The last time her adoptive family saw her was in June of that year, before she made her way to Massachusetts in search of the mother she hadn't seen in 14 years. Leona, however, hadn't changed much. She remained the tough, unyielding woman Nancy had once escaped from, only older and even harsher. Still, Nancy Ann managed to find her. In the fall of 1989, Nancy tracked her down to a rundown 6-unit wooden apartment building on Wilson Road in North Billerica. It was near a train station, surrounded by industrial decay. It wasn't really a home, more like a temporary refuge filled with peeling paint, sagging floors, and neighbors who knew better than to ask questions. Incredibly, Nancy Ann moved in, but there were no emotional reunions, no warm embraces or tearful apologies. Just two people related by blood and a shared but painful history. For a short time, Nancy tried to build a life there, but the old, toxic patterns quickly resurfaced. The fear crept back in, and the tears flowed often. Neighbors saw it all unfold. They would regularly find Nancy Ann crying outside. One neighbor recalled the apartment atmosphere as cold, harsh, and suffocating, saying the Lackeys weren't kind people. Nancy had hoped reconnecting with her mother would heal something inside her, but it only reopened every wound she had tried so hard to close. By December 1989, Nancy Ann was overwhelmed, and by the time January 1990 arrived, she was gone. But she wasn't just missing. She had vanished entirely. Somewhere between the bleak winter days of December and January, the girl who spent her life searching for family became just another lost soul, one no one bothered to search for. No charges were ever brought against Leona or any other family member regarding Nancy Ann's murder. It was a brisk December morning in 1958 in the Columbia River Gorge when a cream and red Ford station wagon drove east from Portland, Oregon, carrying 5 passengers bundled in coats and sweaters. Inside the vehicle were 54-year-old Kenneth Martin, his wife Barbara, aged 48, and their 3 daughters, 14-year-old Barbie, 13-year-old Virginia, and 11-year-old Susan. The Martins had attended a Christmas party the night before, returning afterward to their home in Portland's Rosewood neighborhood. They had mentioned to neighbors and relatives their plan to spend Sunday in the gorge collecting fir and pine boughs to make wreaths. Their plan was nothing out of the ordinary, but come Monday morning, the Martin household was unusually still. Dishes from the prior day were still in the kitchen, laundry was waiting in the washer to be hung out, and the car, along with all 5 Martins, had disappeared. In the days before they went missing, the Martins had shown no unusual behavior. There were no signs of conflict, no known enemies, and no financial trouble. Just a family preparing for Christmas in the Pacific Northwest, focused on wreath-making and creating memories. On Sunday, December 7th, 1958, in the late morning, the Martins got into their 1954 Ford Country Squire station wagon and left their driveway. They made a stop for fuel in Cascade Locks, about 40 miles from home. Dean Baxter, the gas station's owner, remembered them well. He said Kenneth was polite but reserved, and after fueling up with 5 gallons of gas, the family continued heading east. Shortly after, another piece of the timeline appeared. Clara York, a waitress at the Paradise Snack Bar in Hood River, 20 miles beyond Cascade Locks, told authorities she served the Martins a late lunch. She remembered the girls, the station wagon, and said the family drove back west toward Portland afterward, yet they never arrived. This is where the timeline begins to blur. Later reports came in from drivers who believed they saw the family on the Columbia River S North Side in Washington just before nightfall. If true, this meant they would have crossed via the Bridge of the Gods or another crossing, but no receipts, eyewitness confirmations, or physical evidence confirmed this detour. Still, each account described the same picture: a winter-dressed family, cheerful and calm, doing nothing out of the ordinary. Kenneth reportedly wore a tan zip-up jacket and dark trousers. Barbara was seen in a navy blue coat over a plaid jacket and black dress. Barbie wore cuffed jeans and a beige coat. The girls were giggling. Barbara drank coffee and Kenneth paid the bill. It was all so normal, so forgettable. At first, no one was alarmed. There were no cell phones in 1958, and it wasn't unusual for a Sunday outing to stretch into the evening. Perhaps the Martins stayed longer than planned or dropped by a friend's house. Whatever the case, by Monday, it was assumed they'd return. That was the hope, anyway. But Monday came, and they didn't. Kenneth didn't show up to work, which was unusual. Barbie didn't attend Grant High, and Virginia and Susan were also absent from Rose City School. Still, it wasn't until the evening of December 9th that concern turned into alarm. Kenneth's boss, Taylor Eccles, contacted the police to report the family missing. By 11 p.m., officers were at the Martin home. They knocked, waited, and eventually went inside. What they found only increased the sense of unease. There were no signs of a break-in, no shattered windows, no disturbed furniture, no immediate evidence of foul play. The home looked like a family had left quickly for a day trip. There were no signs they'd planned a long absence. No note, no missing suitcases, no packed belongings. Even their bank accounts remained untouched. It seemed like they expected to return by dinner. To complicate matters, despite police responding swiftly after Kenneth's boss reported them missing, the investigation was chaotic. No single agency took control. Responsibility was passed between Portland Police, Multnomah County, and Hood River County. There was no unified command, just a missing family and growing confusion. Eventually, a lead emerged. At Cascade Locks, near where the Martins had last refueled, authorities found tire tracks in a gravel area near the river. The tracks veered dangerously close to the edge, as if a car had reversed straight off it. The Hood River County Sheriff proposed that the family may have accidentally driven off the bluff into the Columbia River. Divers were brought in, and the area was searched, but nothing was found. That possibility led to even darker suspicions. For the first time, people considered that the Martins might not have just gotten lost or had a car mishap. As days became weeks with no progress, the idea of an accident began to lose weight. Something felt off to Portland detective Walter Graven, known for being thorough, skeptical, and even obsessive. He wasn't convinced it was just an accident, at least not without more proof. It was then discovered that on the same day the Martins disappeared, a stolen 1951 white Chevrolet was found abandoned near Cascade Locks. It was suspicious, but since it didn't match the Martins' Ford, it was initially treated as unrelated. However, something inside the stolen car couldn't be ignored. A Rotin .38 Colt revolver was discovered in nearby bushes, stained with dried blood. Things became more bizarre. The gun was traced to Meyer and Frank, a department store in Portland. 2 years earlier, Kenneth and Barbara's estranged son, Donald, had worked there. He had been accused of stealing $2,000 worth of sporting goods and had then disappeared, later joining the Navy. Among the missing items, a handgun, the same make and model as the one found near the abandoned Chevrolet. For reasons that remain unclear, the gun was never examined for fingerprints or blood type, and the authorities allowed the individual who discovered it to keep it. Decades later, his widow revealed that the gun appeared to have been used to strike something. However, by then, the evidence had already been compromised, and the trail had gone cold. Meanwhile, suspicion shifted toward Donald. Detective Walter reached out to interview him over the phone. Donald was courteous and cooperative, though he seemed unemotional about the disappearance of his family. However, he wasn't defensive, and he was thousands of miles away in New York. Despite the fact that a similar gun he had stolen years earlier was found in an area related to the Martin family's disappearance, Donald was excluded as a suspect. On December 8th, one day after the Martins vanished, two ex-convicts named Roy Light and another unnamed man were arrested in Hood River County for stealing the same abandoned Chevrolet. A waiter at the Paradise Snack Bar later reported having seen both men in the diner around the same time the Martin family had been there. Not only that, but they allegedly left just after the Martins did, suggesting they may have followed them and possibly targeted the family. However, after investigating the pair, the police ruled them out as suspects. As a result, by early 1959, the case had shifted from a tragic event into an unresolved mystery. The Martins hadn't simply disappeared. They left behind unsettling half-formed clues that led investigators in various directions, yet ultimately provided no clear answers. The case quickly became a subject of speculation, and the theories began to multiply, outpacing the facts. But on May 1, 1959, nearly 5 months after the Martins vanished, something was disturbed beneath the surface of the Columbia River. A drilling rig near the Dalles, Oregon, caught something heavy on its anchor, something that resisted before slipping free. The next morning, a fisherman and his wife saw two objects floating near Cascade Locks. Upon getting closer, they noticed that the objects drifted away, but not far. By May 3rd, a body was discovered on the north bank of the river near Camas, Washington, about 70 miles from the Dalles. It was confirmed to be Susan, the youngest of the Martin girls, through dental records. The next day, Virginia was found near the Bonneville Dam, also identified through dental records. This news shook Portland, as two of the Martin girls had now been confirmed dead. However, questions arose about the cause of their deaths, as autopsies revealed they had drowned. But some technicians speculated bullet holes might have been present in their skulls. The medical examiner disagreed, attributing the marks to decomposition. The most puzzling detail was the discovery of traces of aluminum embedded in Susan's clothing. This seemed odd until it was revealed that the spot where the bodies were found was directly across from an aluminum smelting plant, leading to speculation that the drilling rig had disturbed the Martins' car and released the bodies. Despite extensive searches with sonar, helicopters, and divers, no more bodies or evidence were recovered, and the search was called off after a diver almost drowned. As a result, two girls were confirmed dead, but the station wagon and 3 family members remained missing. Some people considered the case closed, but Detective Walter, who had been dedicated to the case, refused to give up. He believed the family had been murdered and that the car held the answers. Unfortunately, Walter passed away in 1988 without seeing the case solved. For the next 65 years, the Columbia River kept its secrets beneath its cold waters, rocky beds, and layers of silt. However, in late 2024, a diver named Archer Mayo, motivated by persistent curiosity and modern diving equipment, decided to continue the search. Archer wasn't a detective, just an ordinary diver, but he focused his efforts near Cascade Locks, the location where tire tracks had been spotted back in 1958. After months of surveying the riverbed, Archer found an underwater pit about 20 feet deep. Trusting his instincts, he decided to return the next day and search the pit again. When he dove the following morning, he found it, the remains of a vehicle, buried 15 meters beneath the surface. On March 6, 2025, recovery operations began. By the next day, crews had recovered the chassis, engine, and rear axle of the car, and the paint matched the red and cream color scheme of the Martins' car. Although they couldn't recover the full VIN, Investigators were 99% sure that this was the Martin family's vehicle. Sadly, no human remains were found inside. As of March 2025, the car was transported to a warehouse for further examination by forensic experts. For now, the case remains unresolved. No one knows how or why the Martins' Ford ended up in the Columbia River, and whether it was a tragic accident or something more sinister. Thank you for watching, and if you'd like to listen to the audio version of this video, you can find it on any podcast platform. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it via the form in the description. To support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a member here on YouTube. Thanks again, and I hope to see you in the next one.